forget sunk cost. You are an early stage pre-product market fit startup if you're listening to this episode, right? You cannot afford the luxury of technical debt, business debt, customer debt, cognitive debt. Throw that shit aside. You are a learning machine. You need to be iterative, agile, and move fast. Put it aside and focus on first principles. Go back and focus on your user and focus on your product.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
Hey, I'm Pablo Srugo.
On this week's show, we're going to talk about the 5 steps towards product market fit. First, we're going to talk about what is product market fit, and then the 5 steps you need to take to get there. This is a great way to frame many of the topics we've been talking about for many of the episodes of the show, but we're putting it through the lens of getting to that hockey stick growth and starting to get pull from the market. To discuss this, we've got Pablo on the show. He runs the Product Market Fit Show, which is, you guessed it, all about product market fit. And he's boiled down his lessons to just a few concise points, and we're going to run through them today. All that and much, much more on this week's show. Stay tuned right after the break.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, before we jump into the conversation, we first want to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact. If you've been listening to a few episodes and getting value, we only ask for a few things in return. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcasting app and give us a rating and review. Subscribe to us on YouTube. And if you're listening to this not on YouTube, you really want to get over there on YouTube because this episode has a lot of visuals and a slide deck that we're presenting over at YouTube. Just search for the Startup Podcast. Give us a subscription over there and give us a shout out on your favorite social network. It helps us grow the show and help more founders like you. With that, on with the show. Pablo, let's jump right into it. This is a presentation that you usually give on stage. And so we're going to try to break it up a little bit and turn it into one of our typical masterclass EDU episodes where we will have a conversation along the way. But let's break down the 5 key steps to product market fit.
If you don't mind, I'll actually start with just like a really quick story maybe from my founder days, because this is like, it's funny. It happened back then. And as I was building this presentation, I thought back to this moment, and I really think it's kind of this good jumping off point, right? For why any of this like even matters. So right now I'm a VC and I've been here at Mistral for over 6 years, and I've been running the Product Market Fit Show for the last 3 years, talking to a lot of founders, which is where this stuff comes from. But before that, I was a founder. My startup was called Gym Track, and I was like 22, 23, like first time founder, kind of going for the big home run. And at one point I had a co-founder, Lee, who's my age, and we'd hired this like CFO who was very experienced. He'd been through many acquisitions, really, really smart guy, this guy named Ken. And I remember one time, like we were sitting in a boardroom and Ken wanted us to implement like different controls, like different financial controls, just like little things to make sure we just didn't go offside. I don't remember exactly what, but you can imagine, like as a young founder, I frankly couldn't care less. I was like, I just want to go fast, and break things, like this sort of idea. And like, if it's not, sales, customers, fundraising, like I just couldn't be bothered. I really didn't care. And so we're having like this back and forth, discussion. And Ken is like really good with these like punchy lines, right? So at one point he looks at me and he's like, Pablo, why do cars have brakes? I'm like, Ken, like, what are you talking about, man? Like, I don't have time for this. Like, what is this? And he's like, why do cars have brakes? And I'm like, I don't know, man. So they can stop. And he's like, no, it's so they can go faster. And for me, that just hit, in a different way. And I thought back to that moment because I was like, man, what Ken really understood is, as a first-time founder, you're learning everything from the get-go. You're making so many avoidable mistakes. So that's why I made like this presentation, right? Because at the end of the day, like you're going to make mistakes no matter what, but there's avoidable mistakes and unavoidable mistakes. And you have to avoid the avoidable mistakes because that really dials up your odds of success. So that's really the goal of this presentation, is taking what I've learned talking to over 100 founders through the Product Market Fit Show and just boiling it down to like 5 steps of the things that they've done right to get to product market fit.
I love this. I often talk about in my advisory work, my job is to help you avoid wasted time and dead ends and just fast forward to the right answer as quickly as possible. And I'm often quick to point out, this is not because I'm some kind of rocket science genius. It's just I've made every mistake personally multiple times and figured out why the thing is counterintuitive and why you need to go a different way. And so trying to boil that down for this show, trying to boil this down for your show, trying to boil it down for advisory. This is the name of the game, because I think both of us and all of us involved in making this thing are very passionate about helping founders achieve their dreams and not wasting potential and wasting capital and wasting the chance to change the world. So very cool. So this is really distilling everything you've learned through your show and through your experiences into 5 key steps. And also it's worth pointing out, why does product market fit matter, right? Product market fit, before we dive into the 5 steps of achieving it, let's just talk about, just for a second, what it is and why it's important.
This is the core to early stage, right? And obviously it's a nebulous concept. It's hard to define. But what I found talking to early stage founders is, if you ask across different industries, different business models, and you're like, what's like your number one goal? What's your number one objective? And it typically is some version of trying to find product market fit. As Mark Andreessen had described at this moment, when the thing that you're offering to the people you're offering to the market just kind of clicks together and you start getting true pull from the market. You're not in just a pure like push motion, and symptoms of it are, very fast growth rates. Maybe your problems are no longer like growing top line, but it's actually like product or operations or customer success, because there's just so much going on. There's so many fires you got to put out, but it's all because of growth. So those are like the outcomes of finding product market fit. And that's why it's so important. And I think many times like companies will make it far down, like they'll raise an A or even a B and actually like never really had product market fit, but so much money was put in, so much effort was put in that they were able to grow top line. But then at some point, it just starts to plateau and you're really kind of moving a boulder up a hill. And that's what we're trying to avoid.
I think it's fair to say that product market fit is one of the first and most important major milestones a company needs to achieve. When I first heard this concept of pull versus push, it took me quite a while to understand it. So I want to unpack that also just for a few more minutes. So push, when you're in push mode, you are like out there hustling hard. You're like trying to talk to anyone who will listen, grinding, like, please try my product. Please give it a go, give it a chance. Please stick around. Please find the value that I'm trying to deliver for you. Pull is when people start coming out of the woodwork. You start getting signups and you didn't run an ad or you didn't email someone. People start referring it to each other and you didn't ask them to. The market starts to pull it out of your hands and say, I need more. And so product market fit feels like momentum. It feels like the wind is at your back, and it feels like easy growth, easy momentum. People struggle to figure out how to define it and how to measure it and all this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, it differs from company to company. And it's sort of like, it when you see it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. The same useless line, but it's true, man. What can you do?
It's like pornography, right? You know it when you see it, right?
Yes.
So, all right. So that's a lot of preamble about where this came from and why product market fit is important. So let's go through these 5 key steps that you've boiled it down to. Now, of course, I just want to let founders know who are listening, this is really, really hard. In many ways, our entire show is about this. I'm sure your entire show is about this, Pablo. And so here we're just trying to distill it again in a new framing, in a new remix to try to help bring this message home. But just don't feel badly if you're like, I'm not following, or like, I tried these 5 things or wait, how the hell do I do that 3rd thing? You just got to go listen to the back catalog of our podcasts and it'll become clear. There's a lot to do. So, all right, let's go through this. Okay. Step 1, you've described here in our show notes is research mode.
Yes. And let me just set some context for this. I'm sure you and every single person listening to this podcast knows this book, The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Obviously talks about MVP and all this sort of things. And it's been great, right? Because it's led this revolution of like, how can we just put something out in market with the least effort possible? I think the problem is that the kind of skim read version of this is don't waste time, just put something out and see if it sticks. And what I've actually realized speaking with so many of these successful founders is there's a step before that lean startup mode, and it's called research mode. And I'll give you an example to talk about, somebody who did this really well. So one of the people I spoke with was Mike, the CEO of Ada, which is doing, over $50 million ARR. It's a unicorn, etc. But it didn't obviously start that way. And actually, his first startup idea was this thing called Volley, and it was this like social search engine. And, it started growing. It actually he raised like a pre-seed round, about $500,000 or so. And, started growing, started getting some traction, but it was never like about product market fit, just never had like that clear pull. And what he started to realize as he went through it is that as he had more and more users, the customer service experience, which, many startups put so much emphasis on customer service in the early days because they can control it, and they should. And he was doing that. But that experience started to wither away. And he was like, well, how can I keep this super high bar on customer experience, on customer success, on supporting my users as I kind of grow my user base? And as he researched it, he realized that there was kind of like no good way to do it. What he ended up doing is he took a step back and decided to completely pivot and go after this totally different use case of trying to scale a customer service experience. The crazy thing is that he was venture backed. Like, he was venture backed on a specific plan that was, hey, go grow Volley. And instead, what he and his co-founder decided to do was spend full-time hours as customer service agents and automate themselves out of the job in order to create the product. So they got hired by different companies that had customer support agents that, help customers on chat or whatever it is. They did that job full time. That's research. Like, that's trying to understand really, wait a second, what is customer service? Like, what does that really look like? What is the day-to-day like? Then they started to build automations to do many of the pieces that they were already doing, many of those workflows. And what comes out of that is Ada. And Ada then becomes, this $50 million plus. It was like in the chatbot era, right? Like, there were so many chatbots back in like 2013, 14, 15. They were one of these chatbots. Their chatbot actually worked, is still very successful. And now obviously implementing AI and all that stuff. But the reason it worked so well is because they understood the problem, the real problem, in a very specific and subtle way. And the reason that happened was because they did real research mode for a full year as full-time customer service agents before building the product, before building the MVP.
It sounds like you were saying as they were doing this for a year, they were also iterating on the product. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's kind of right. I mean, the starting point was literally like, let's just go be customer service agents. And then, whether it's a month in or 2 months in, as they start learning the job, then they start automating themselves out of that job. So then this kind of product, but it's not like they're necessarily selling that product at that stage. They're still really in this kind of weird research mode. It's funny, this research mode, because if somebody were to ask them, just socially, like, hey, what are you doing? What are you building? They're like, well, we're just like being customer service agents trying to replace themselves, but they're not even like selling a product yet.
So we have to be very precise here, right? Because oftentimes founders will go into research mode, and what they think research mode is to have an idea and pitch that idea to 10, 20, 50, 150 people and see if those people like resonate and go, oh my God, that's great. I would love that if you would build it. They think of that as kind of product discovery, product research, market validation. And I just want to caution here, that's not what you're describing. What you're describing is not talking to customers with an idea and hoping that they say that's great. You're talking about digging deep into living the problem, going and becoming a domain expert on the problem. And they weren't just doing that academically. They weren't just like asking for problem after problem after problem. It sounds like they were building and iterating a solution as they were doing that. And this is key, right? So this is why actually the lean startup is relevant, is because if you just spend a year academically putting just an idea in front of people and go, do you like this? Most people are trying to be kind, trying to appear smart, and trying to be useful. And so when you say to them, would you like this idea? In their kindness, they will go, yeah, that's a great idea. Keep on going. And in their effort to appear smart, they'll go, yeah, I think Sally would like that, because if you just add this feature and that feature, Sally will definitely want it.
Exactly.
That's not validation. That's people being kind and trying to be smart. The best validation is actually building stuff and putting it into the world and seeing if it helps people. You can call that a form of research, but really it's a form of lean execution, learning, and iteration. And you do that with running code. And people actually have to physically pick it up and use it, not just give you platitudes of that's a great idea. And unless and until they pick it up and use it and continue to love using it, you're nowhere near product market fit, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, funny enough, just to vibe on that, like obviously at some point you got to put this thing out to the world and we'll get into that. But what I actually noticed was before putting something out into the world, taking the time to really understand your customers. Another example comes to mind called it's a company called Legion that builds like payroll software for coffee chains and these sort of places. Like he was a developer, but then worked in a coffee chain for like weeks before going out and building, because part of it was like scheduling and these sort of things. And so finding a way, and other people like Cement, which is another company that's doing tens of millions in ARR, they did more of the traditional like speak to customers, but it wasn't, hey, here's my idea, do you think it's cool? It was very much like, tell me about your problem, tell me about your day-to-day. I think the high level objective here is find a real problem, because so many companies fail because the problem they're out to solve isn't even that important. So even if you build the perfect product that really solves that problem, you're always pushing uphill because your customer is like, that's great, that's awesome, but like come back next quarter, I got other things that are more important.
I think the way I would frame this first step then is really about understanding the problem.
Yes.
And understanding the domain really, really well. Again, though, just to have some gotchas, understanding the problem purely academically, meaning just hearing it secondhand, is not often good enough.
Correct.
Understanding the problem too much from a domain expert can be distracting because they tend to not understand how to read the label from the inside. So they have all of these quote unquote best practices and domain dogma. And so you need to translate what you learn and what you understand through first principles, product taste, judgment, instinct, and rethinking the whole thing from a technology point of view. But if you are able to dig really deep, embed with the people you're trying to help, as you're talking about, become the barista, become the customer service agent, and iterate your way through that, then you'll have a deep understanding of the problem and an increasingly good understanding of the problem over time as you're learning and iterating.
So then, step two, I'll talk about this other book really quickly. Only the Paranoid Survive, super famous by Andy Grove. Great book. Everyone should read it. It talks about, though, a late stage problem, right? Success breeds complacency. Complacency breeds failure. Only the paranoid survive. So when you're hyper successful, $100 million, $1 billion in revenue, and you start to get complacency, and when complacency kind of breeds into the culture, then you tend to fail. So you have to be paranoid as a late stage CEO.
This is ironic that Andy Grove from Intel would be the one to say this.
That's right.
Intel is currently the poster child of.
I feel like they didn't read his own book.
That's right. Well, he's not the CEO anymore, right?
Oh, I know, but
Yeah.
you'd think they'd at least read it. But I think the counterpart to this in the early days, getting to product market fit in terms of what I've seen from teams, from people, the people side, is only the insanely focused survive. Like just the level of maniacal focus that I've seen from these founders that have been super successful in those early days, to me was pretty mind-blowing, right? So here's an example. Mike Katchen, he's the founder of Wealthsimple, which is like the Robin Hood of Canada. It's a $5 billion-ish company today. He told me that like in the early days, he was doing like a it was a free consumer app. And what he was doing was he was so obsessed with like customer satisfaction, with his early customers being happy, that he would call his customers within 30 seconds of them signing up. Not like B2B, they're paying $10,000 a year. Like obviously you're going to call them. These are like free users who will probably never pay you a cent. He's calling them within 30 seconds. He's giving them his personal number. And he's like, if you ever need anything, call me directly. Like, I just want to know how you heard about us. I want to know any problems you have. These are the sort of things that if you describe to, let's say, a non-founder, they'd be like, that's crazy. It's insane. And it is. It's insane. It's insanely focused, right? Like, this is another example of Mark, who's now running a over $100 million revenue business called Go Bold. He had a 1-800 line for like, kind of problems, right? 24/7. He's the one answering it. He's picking up at 2 a.m. Like, he's doing insane, crazy things. The sort of things that would be so obvious for you to outsource. But when you're obsessed about customer service, like he was, insane focus tells you if that's the most important thing, then that's the most important thing. And I've got to be the person that's responsible for that. And so whenever his phone rang, he would pick it up because maybe it's a sale, maybe it's a problem, maybe it's something important. And either way, he wants to be the one to know about it. So I think that's the second thing that I've seen like very common amongst this group of hyper successful founders is just this insane level of focus that leads to like really weird things, but that for this stage of the business, I think make perfect sense.
So two things on this. In my vocabulary, kind of the way I would frame this is actually not so much focus, but hustle and obsession and doing things that don't scale. So this is about like being obsessed and pulling out all the stops, right? And just doing whatever it takes through sheer force of will to bring your vision into reality and to connect with your customers, understand what they're going through, and make your company grow. But at the same time, I actually think focus, as I would define it, is also insanely important, right? On this show, we've talked about focus over and over and over again. In fact, there's an episode in our back catalog here. I'm seeing it's September 16, 2024. We call it Conviction, the essential ingredient for focus and scale. And, this is just one of the many episodes we've talked about around focus. And one of the metaphors we've used, Genevieve and I, is a hunter can't chase two rabbits at the same time. If the rabbits go off in two different directions, if you try to split the difference and go some third vector in a different direction, thinking you're going to catch both rabbits, it's not going to happen. And so not only do you have to be obsessive and hustle hard, as you're describing here, you need to do it on an embarrassingly narrow problem and solution, embarrassingly narrow, and not hedge and split the difference. And so you talked about, this idea of paranoia from the CEO of Intel. Often founders make the mistake of being too paranoid that they're going to fail. So they're paranoid that they're going to miss out opportunities or that the thing they've chosen is not the right thing. So they're hedging. And hedging, it's the paranoia that leads them to a lack of focus, a diffusion of focus. And so you need to be not paranoid that your thing is not going to work. You need to be paranoid that you are not focused enough and really, really just go all in.
Your default dead in the early stages, like 99% of these companies don't make it. So like paranoia is only going to help you so much, and actually could be detrimental because it'll make you overprotect. Like you've got to focus on the things that might make you that 1 or 10% that survive. And that's the hustle. And I say focus, by the way, one thing that I think is important is like, if you're answering the 1-800 call every time it rings, you're not doing a lot of other things that you could be doing with that time. And so focus is inherently a trade-off. Like if you're focused on one thing, on one rabbit, you got to let the other one go. And so that's where these two things miss. For sure, hustle is part of the equation. It's also, though, this insane level of prioritization and deciding that, for example, for GoBold, customer service is the most important thing. I'm answering the 1-800 line. I'm insanely focused on that. Yeah, I won't have time for this and this and this and that maybe normal CEO should have time for. But like, this is my focus. And I think that's a core part of getting to success.
There's also another thing that this is touching on, which is there's a saying that every founder has kind of grabbed onto and completely misunderstood, which is the Airbnb do things that don't scale initially. And so, him calling everybody within 30 seconds doesn't scale. And in Airbnb's case, Brian Chesky talked about how they went out and took the photos themselves and made the photos amazing because they realized high quality photos were a key to success. But founders often misunderstand that advice, and they think do things that don't scale, as in non-recurring engineering, bespoke work, custom consulting, and doing whatever it takes to win an account through custom software and professional services. So just again, because you showed something here that doesn't scale, it scales in the sense that it is bootstrapping a scalable marketplace or a scalable social network, or in Airbnb's case, a scalable marketplace of accommodation, right? So they weren't custom building software for Marriott. Yes, that doesn't scale, but it's also fucking stupid because that's not on the business model, right? What they were doing was going out and taking the first few photos to set the bar for their scalable marketplace. So they did things that don't scale to bootstrap a scalable marketplace.
That's right.
And that's the second part of the sentence that most founders miss out. So yeah, there's hustle here. There's doing things that don't scale. There's being obsessive. And then there is being paranoid about the right things. And then there is insane focus. I think all of that is encapsulated here in this step 2 that you're outlining, which is great, Pablo.
And so then step 3, this is where we get more into like the validation piece of it. I like to call this, you have to be in the market to win the market, right? And that's the only way that you're going to discover the sort of unique, subtle insights that are going to make the difference. My go-to example for this, Wattpad is now like, it's a marketplace for readers and writers. People write like original books, publish them on Wattpad, people read them. They've got like 100 million or so active users, and they ended up selling for about 600 million US. But it was a weird story if you look at how it all kind of happened. And I think a lot of times we write these stories in hindsight. Alan, who was on the Product Market Fit show, could have told me like, I knew that people wanted to express themselves and like people would read original content. And so we created this marketplace and all these sort of things. It actually started, and this is a really like kind of older company, still doing well today, but I mean, it started in the early mobile pre-smartphone era. And the first iteration of this was, how can people read books on the go? Like, how can people read classic books on their little flip phones? And that was the app that Alan and his team built. And then he wanted people to kind of publish books later, but the first one was just letting people read books. And then as he started to get word of mouth and people started talking about his platform as the best place to read classic books on the go, and they started to write blog articles about this super hyper niche idea problem that you could never build like a unicorn deck for, right? But it was actually solving somebody's problem. It led to insights, which then led him to kind of start this marketplace model where it was like, well, what if people could write books specifically for this kind of this setup, this interface? And then it started that flywheel. And it actually took him, I believe, like 2 years or so for him to get the first upload onto this marketplace of an original book. And then there's all these other things that came in that were frankly unpredictable, or at least very hard to predict, like the iPhone being such a huge success, the App Store coming in and letting him build, because before that, like to upload apps was a nightmare. And so then he finally was able to build like an iOS and an Android app and these sort of things and ride this mobile wave, which ultimately was a huge part of the reason that Wattpad became the big success that it became. And so like, I think he had seen some of it, like he saw the UGC, the user generated content wave starting, because that was even pre-mobile, but he didn't know that the iPhone would come out and smartphone revolution would be as big as it was, but he benefited from it. And it's a hard one to kind of put together, but you have to be in the market to win the market. Means to me that at some point, if you've done the research and you feel like, okay, there's a real problem here, and you've decided the sort of things that really matter and you've prioritized and you're going to get really focused, you will not have all the answers. You have to ultimately put something out there and start that kind of flywheel of learning to discover the sort of insights, to have the sort of things happen that are going to ultimately lead to success.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is really about agility and iteration, right? So we've talked about this idea that you can't research in a vacuum and in a pure academic way. And this is taking this to the next level, right? As you're in the market, and even if you've had a little bit of success, you need to be paying close attention to what the signals are from the market, where the trends are going, what's working, what's not working. And you need to be agile enough to adjust, to capture new opportunities, and to evolve as you learn and as the market changes. Now, the real trick here is walking the line between agility and thrash. And so like just the last step that we discussed, we talked about you can't chase two rabbits. And so the question is, when is it okay to spot the next rabbit, or to pivot off that rabbit that you lost and go to the next rabbit? And this, in some cases, just takes art, taste, intuition, judgment. In some cases, it can take data. So one of the previous episodes we talked about with the CEO of Eucalyptus, where they're launching kind of brand after brand, market after market. We talked about S-curves. When you know that your first business, your first feature, your first product is reached that hockey stick and it's growing, at some point, it's going to start to taper off. And you want to start building your next S-curve and your next big idea, so that you can start to ladder that together with your other business, your first business. And so there's a real art here of having a vision, understanding the problem you're working on, staying focused and disciplined, but also listening carefully, noticing trends and opportunities or shifts in market, technology, sentiment, culture, regulation, and knowing when to pounce or when to add to your business. And it's unfortunately, this is one of those things that just takes experience. It takes good counsel. It takes right sizing your business and your capital and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, you have to be really tuned in.
That's right. And I think you just at some point have to kind of take that leap in and understand that things will evolve, things will change, and you'll learn so much more as you get into it. Like Applyboard is another good example of this. Martin started that, and now it's like hundreds of millions in revenue. But when he started, this is like a platform to help international students study abroad. And he didn't even know that in these other countries, there's like this whole world of agents, the little micro businesses that help these international students get abroad. And so he started by going direct to these students. And only by doing that did he start to like organically have these agents leverage his platform. Now, Applyboard is predominantly used by agents, and it's basically the stack that sits on top of these micro businesses that lets the agents do their job better. But he didn't know that before he launched, right? And so this is the kind of step-by-step piece of building a startup that makes it all so unpredictable. I think often you want to have like all the answers. You want to have this thought out plan, these forecasts and all this stuff. And you got to get out there and kind of take some punches to the face first and then see where it goes.
Yanev likes to say startups are learning machines. So anyone listening to us here who has spent months and months and months developing, tens and hundreds of pages of a business plan, you lose. You are failing. Stop. If you are a perfectionist is just an excuse for procrastinator. If you want a whole plan laid out for you, then you are too risk averse to be a founder. Quit. Go do something else. You must be willing to be agile, to be iterative, to learn, to fail. Failure is not just okay. It is an integral part of the process. You have to put an experiment, try something, see its limits or its complete failure, and then iterate and try something else. And so unless and until you can get into that mindset, you are in the wrong business. There's just really no way to mince the words about that. This is really, really important. Some people are just really anal retentive and they need to know everything up front and they just do not like to fail and they get very emotional and entangled in stuff. You're not a great startup founder. We like to be very pointed on this show, Pablo. What are we really saying here? What we're really saying is it's launch, learn, listen, don't be thrashy, and be prepared for your plan to get thrown out and to adapt to what you learn through the process.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
So this is the last book I promise that I'm going to throw you. And this might be one that actually some people don't know of. Man's Search for Meaning. It's actually my favorite book. It's actually more of a psychology book. But anyways, there's this one quote and he says, "Happiness is and must remain a side effect or byproduct and is destroyed and spoiled to the degree to which it is made a goal in itself." Which makes total sense. Like if you want to be happy, you can't just like force yourself to be happy. You have to like find meaningful work, have meaningful relationships, invest in your health. And then as a byproduct, you tend to become happy. I found through the product market fit show that there is a kind of counterpart to this in startup land, which is that growth is and must remain a side effect or byproduct and is destroyed and spoiled to the degree to which it is made a goal in itself, at least in the early days. Later on, when you're like Uber size, public company, whatever, and you have proven levers on sales, on marketing, product, customer service, whatever it is, that you can invest into, that you can tweak, that you have proof points that lead to certain amounts of growth, you can make growth a goal in itself. And you can say, next year, I want to grow at 20%, and here are the things that we're going to do. But before you have product market fit, you don't have any of these levers proven out. And you can't put the cart before the horse. You can't all of a sudden say, this quarter, we're going to grow. Here's my forecast. We're going to grow 30%, because you have no idea why you're growing in the first place. You have to focus on something else. And so step 4 is kind of this forget growth, find value idea. Like the first thing you need to obsess about in those early days is to deliver real value. Growth will come as a result. A good example of this that we had on the show is Jack Newton from Clio, which is a startup out of Vancouver, now probably in the $3 to $4 billion range. When he started, there's this really interesting example he gave me. He kind of had this platform in the legal tech world, and he had this beta, right, that he wanted to take customers through. What he did for that beta is he actually added friction to the funnel. So what he said was, in order to be part of this beta, you have to watch, I think it was a pretty small ask, right? But it was like, you have to watch this like 30-minute video, and only if you do that can you be part of this beta. Now, the reason he did that is because he wanted a small handful of very highly engaged customers. It wasn't about growth. It wasn't about getting the most number of customers, because think about it. The number one thing you learn in growth is remove friction, remove barriers. You want to grow faster? Like make things easier for people. But that makes sense if your goal is to grow. His goal wasn't to grow. His goal was just to deliver clear value. And to do that, he didn't need 1,000 companies in his beta. He needed a few dozen, but specifically a few dozen that really cared, that were going to invest the time, that were going to give him the feedback, because then he felt like he could actually get closer to delivering real value. And I think that's a clear thing that people tend to miss. And the way this usually comes out, the way that I see the mistake is forecasts. Even like a year, 2 years, forget 5 years, right? But like even, hey, like next year, we're going to do this much in revenue. That's great when you have got 5-10 million in revenue. But specifically, it's great when you know that, hey, last year we spent this much on this marketing channel. We're going to double it and we should get twice the amount, right? And you've got a few of these different formulas that you've actually proven out. And you're like, we're just going to dial them by this much. And so this much should come out. It's still a guessing game, but it's grounded in like real foundation and real reality. But when you don't have that and you're like, yeah, next year we're going to do 2 million in revenue, it's completely made up. And all of a sudden, I find companies start measuring themselves against this like pseudo forecast. And it's like, we're ahead of forecast, we're behind forecast. And I'm like, I don't care because it's a made up forecast anyways. Forget, like, let's put growth on the side for a second. We're not there yet. Let's focus on how much value are you really delivering? How much do your customers really love your product? Because only when you really crack that will you start to get the pull that then allows you to invest, that then allows you to start focusing on growth itself.
Yeah, this is such an easy, obvious, and common mistake. There are worse examples than this. There are people that are not focused on growth. They're focused on revenue. They're focused on subscriptions. They're focused on, I had a founder that said to me, we wanted people to pay $180 for this, but they're only willing to pay $80 for this. So we failed. So we can try something else. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There are so many aberrant behaviors or false North Stars that can send you off into all of these crazy directions. The only thing that matters, as you're saying, Pablo, is creating value. But then the next question that founders need to understand is like, what does creating value mean? What creating value means is A, solving problems, or B, generating dopamine. That's it. It only means one of those two things. Maybe there's a third that I'm not thinking about right now, right? It's like, have you found a real problem, real painful and urgent problem for someone? And are you making it better? And if not, keep working until you make it better. Or are you giving them dopamine, like, think of Tinder or think of, Google or think of pornography, right? It has to be one of those two things. And even those you could characterize as solving problems, by the way.
Yeah, some of those are solving problems. Some of them, but I get what you're saying. And especially on the consumer side, sometimes it's not really like a problem. It's more of a, oh yeah, this is awesome. So then you start using it.
Entertainment, right? So TV, movies, and so on. And so, there's so many founders, almost every founder I meet who's running into trouble with growth or revenue or subscriptions or retention. I ask them, like, what's going on with the product? Do people find value? Are they getting the aha moment? Where are they dropping off? What is the number one reason that more people aren't getting more value? And they're like, well, we sort of don't know. We've been focused on growth. We've been focused on revenue. We've been focused on, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And yeah, if you have a massive business and you have a statistically meaningful or a massive throughput through that business, you're Google, then you can be Marissa Mayer and you can be optimizing shades of blue to increase the conversion rate from 11% to 11.2% so that you can be entirely focused on growth. But if you are in the early days and you're pre-product market fit, which is by definition what this episode's about, right, is how to find product market fit, the only thing that matters is creating value by solving problems or generating dopamine. That's it. So go back and focus on your user and focus on your product.
And step 5, I think, is a perfect segue, because the way you know that you're creating value is you solve the number one problem. And if you don't, the key thing I've seen is so many examples of pivots, right? And so my step 5 is pivot harder, faster. I'll tell you this, I've interviewed well over 100, I'm not sure the exact number, let's say over 100 successful founders. And I've never heard someone tell me that they regret a pivot they made. I've heard a lot of people say to me, I wish I pivoted sooner, but not, I wish I never made that pivot. That's just so rare, it's almost worth ignoring. And so I think what happens is, and I get it because I've been there, like as a founder, you build something, you devote all this time and energy to it. The last thing you want to do is throw it away. There's so much sunk cost in there. But if you're not solving a number one problem, it's oftentimes the best thing you can do is something much closer to like a restart than you might think. The example I have for this, it's almost like a textbook pivot. I love this story. Rob from Noibu, now doing tens of millions in ARR, first time founders, and they start with this like really cool sounding idea of building 3D storefronts for retail stores, literally because like it sounded cool. So the idea was if you go and you shop online at any given, let's say, clothing store, they all look the same. They're like these catalog 2D views. But if you go to their stores, there's all this experience. There's so much money invested into the layout. What if you could take like 3D imaging of it and put that online and you can click through and all this stuff? Again, like sounded kind of cool. Didn't really make much sense if you get down to the fundamentals of it. But they hustled their way to something. They had 15 customers, 3,000 in MRR in 2 years, right? So clearly like pushing a boulder up a hill, but not zero. And so they always had like something that kept them going. At what point what happened was they had this really big retailer that had moved through the pipeline, moved through the sales cycle. And I remember, because I was really close to these guys, they would tell me like, man, once these guys sign, like everything's going to change. It's such a big deal for us. It's totally going to change our revenue trajectory. And then they got the call back and he remembers the date. Imagine this. He remembers the date on the podcast. He told me it was February 27th, 2019, where they call him back and they're like, listen, we reviewed the budget for next year. We had to make some adjustments. We'll reconsider you next year. That's some of the most painful stuff to hear. Like when you're hearing that next year, come back next quarter, like sometimes it's true, but if you're hearing that consistently, it's just another way of them telling you, you're not, like, they're buying something else this quarter and it's not your thing. So you're almost by definition not solving a number one problem. And in startup land, if you ain't first, you're last. Like that's really the Ricky Bobby kind of way to think about it. So what do? They shut down the product. They literally said, okay, we're not selling this anymore. They called all their customers. They said, listen, guys, we're not doing this anymore. And they did like going back to those steps. They went back to step one. They did real research. They asked about real problems. Like, what's your day-to-day like? They really started the whole thing through and they uncovered a completely different problem around checkout errors. It turns out that these customers were losing 5 to 10% of their sales at checkout because people on some device, on some browser version would try to click buy and the thing wouldn't work. It was literally different bugs that they had in many different instances, and it was costing them 5 to 10% of revenue. So they went out and started solving that problem. And in 2 years, it's like in the first version, it took 2 years to get to 3,000 MRR. After going through all these steps and doing this really hard pivot, 2 years after that, they were doing 300,000 in MRR. So a completely kind of night and day, same team, same vertical, still e-commerce, but completely different result when they were solving a number one problem. And this is probably the hardest step. Honestly, it's just pivoting harder, faster, because you're taught to be resilient, to be persistent. You actually 100% need that. And yet, if you're barking up the wrong tree, pushing a boulder up a hill, whatever analogy you want to think about, it's just, you can't will yourself to success in that way. You have to fundamentally be going after something that really matters to your customer. And that's when all the other ingredients like hustle and persistent and so on will take you towards success. But if you don't have that, it's near impossible to get there.
One of the biggest mistakes in my career, and by the way, I've made all of these mistakes. So
have I.
all this advice.
So have I, just for what's worth.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the ones that sticks with me is when we pivoted, A, we didn't pivot fast enough, and B, we didn't pivot hard enough, as you, to put it the way you're putting it. I would say, rather than the word hard, I would describe it as complete, a complete pivot. So often people will change their target market, or maybe they'll change their product a little bit. But often what they need to do is change their product quite dramatically. As soon as you change the target market and the product actually often needs a much more radical rethink than you would have initially imagined. But that's not where you need to stop. Then people sort of forget that they need to change their business model potentially. They need to change their pricing. They need to change their positioning. They need to sometimes change the brand, the entire brand. And more dramatically, you sometimes need to change the entire team or change your investors, right? So you need to actually go out and raise again from different investors who believe a different thing. And so it is often underestimated how impactful, how deep and wide the implications of your pivot are. So you need to go way beyond target market, way beyond positioning, way beyond some slight changes to the product, all through the entire stack of your business. And that's what you mean, I think, Pablo, by harder. It really means reevaluate every aspect of your business. The other thing you touched on, which I just want to echo for everybody, is forget sunk cost. You are an early stage pre-product market fit startup, if you're listening to this episode, right? You cannot afford the luxury of technical debt, business debt, customer debt, right? Legacy, the cognitive debt. Throw that shit aside. You are a learning machine. You need to be iterative, agile, and move fast. Put it aside and focus on first principles. Where does this pivot really take you?
Yeah, 100%. There's almost this weird, like, negative connotation I find sometimes with founders and pivots. I'll talk to them, and then let's say some amount of quarters later or whatever, I'll talk to them again. They're doing something different. And I'm like, oh, you pivoted. Well, no, it wasn't really a pivot. I mean, if you think about it, we just kind of changed. And I'm like, it's okay. Like, like, that's fine. Embrace it. You know what I mean? Like, the thing you had at the beginning wasn't really working. So you had the courage to say that it wasn't working and do something else and pivot, own it. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. And frankly, I think anybody that's been in early stage long enough should kind of expect it. They're few and far between the companies that just get it right on like V1. In many, many cases, there's some amount of pivoting, like it's a scale, right? But some amount of pivoting, in many cases serious, in order to find, true success.
Yeah, and again, a shout out for our back catalog. We've talked about pivoting quite a lot in the show. There's an episode, B2C versus B2B2C, early execution overview, your MVP sucks. I'm just looking back through our catalog here, and we know the word pivot is mentioned a lot in the show notes. So please do a search on tsp.show and find all the episodes about pivoting. This is really important. It just goes so far and so deep. What happened to me was we were 2, 3, 4, 5 months into a pivot, and I realized we hadn't changed some really important stuff that in hindsight was so obvious. It was embarrassing, and it was really affecting the business, and it was a real headwind for us. This is very, very cool, Pablo. Thank you for walking us through all of this. And so just to quickly summarize here, we're talking about start in research mode, or actually dig deep into the problem, really understand what's going on, but don't be too academic. Don't try to validate by just asking people if you like this thing. Be insanely focused and hustle, pull out all the stops, and do whatever it takes to make your vision a reality through sheer force of will. Do things that don't scale, but only on the road to a scalable business. And you have to be in the market to win. So that means launch, listen, learn, iterate, adapt, but don't thrash. Be careful about thrash. And then you need to be not obsessed with growth and revenue and subscriptions and trying to drive some business outcome. You need to, in the early stages, be obsessed with finding a real problem and solving it for realsies. Solve real problems or create dopamine, and then and only then can you actually start to grow and focus on growth. And then finally, as we just touched on, you may need to pivot. You may, in the end, just be in the wrong space or in the wrong message and the wrong problem, and you need to pivot. And when you do, pivot hard, reevaluate the whole business from first principles and rethink the whole thing. Pablo, thank you so much for boiling down, your hundreds of episodes on the show, on your show, the Product Market Fit Show, into this concise, 1 hour package. It's been very, very helpful.
Well, thanks for having me on, Chris. And I'll leave you with this, because I know, having been through it and speaking with, a lot of founders as you do, like, these are 5 steps. I think they can definitely help, but they're not a guarantee, to finding product market fit. That's the reality. Is it's more art than science. And I could see founders thinking like, okay, but I've done all these, or I could see myself doing all these and still not get there. And it's 100% true. Like, just because you do all 5 of these doesn't mean that you're going to get to product market fit. But let me end with one story, because I find stories are the most compelling. For those who can see this is the face of a founder who's a good friend of mine who's approved this message on a Cockroach. And I call him the founder Cockroach. He started a company called Blockthrough. But before that, in 2010, just before I met him, he started his first startup, which ultimately failed. In 2013, which was when I met him, he started his second startup, and that also failed. And there was a whole conflict and all this stuff with his co-founder. So it was not, a pretty kind of situation. By 2015, so he's 5 years into kind of his startup journey, let's say, and he starts this company called Blockthrough, and it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well at all, actually. For 2015, 2016, 2017, he's got truly nothing. Like, hasn't really fundraised. He's raised a few angel rounds, but he was telling me he's hustling for a $25,000 check, and then he's got like 4 weeks of runway at any given time. This is after 8 years, if you think about it, 8 years of work of building startup. He's got effectively 0 success, nothing to show for it. And I want to accentuate this point, because when you start in 2010, when he started in 2010 and he was in his early 20s, it was really cool. And I'm sure he went into places and people were like, oh, wow, you got a startup. That's awesome. 8 years in, not only is he exhausted and tired, but his friends, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're successful execs. Like they've moved up in the world. All of a sudden, like you lose all that coolness factor, but you're still fighting the hard fight. And like I said, at one point he has 4 weeks of runway and he puts out, and I was getting these because I'm a good friend of it. I was getting like the monthly email. So I was kind of seeing this, live aside of just the product market fit show when he told me the full story, but I was getting these updates. And he had 4 weeks of runway and he puts out the third version of his product. And this is what happens. Just absolute explosive growth for the first time in his startup journey. Like it just really hits everything that he learned, all the different tweaks that he'd make, finally end up in the product that customers truly wanted. He gets that product market fit, 5-6 months from launch, he's doing $100,000 a month, right? And I was getting these emails, it was like 0, then 10, then 20, then 40, then 80, then 100K a month in revenue. And ultimately, Marty went off and he was able to, like a few years into it, I guess a couple years ago, he sold his company. He sold it for nearly $100 million. He didn't raise much, so he did like very, very well as a result of this. But I think the point of this story is if you do all those other 5 steps, there is no guarantee that you're going to get product market fit on your current startup or even on your next one, that this product's going to work, or even if you pivot that the next product's going to work. I think the only kind of guarantee, if you can even call it that I've seen that you can hit product market fit is doing what Marty did and staying in the game. Every single time, increasing your odds, taking those learnings, dialing up, making less avoidable mistakes, but fundamentally staying in the game long enough for something to truly work out.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Pablo, how can people find you on the internet? How can they find your show? How can they subscribe?
Yeah, so I mean, the Product Market Fit Show is anywhere that the Startup Podcast is on, right? So all the podcast players. I'm also active on LinkedIn. And if you're starting something and want to talk more from like the fundraising angle, I'm a partner at Mistral VC, which is a seed stage firm investing across Canada and the US. Chris, thanks so much for having me, man. This has been great, and love the kind of the back and forth because again, I'm always learning and always love like the different perspectives on any of these different kind of topics.
Yeah, and if you'd like to find me, you can find me at chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter. Or if you'd like to work one-on-one, you can find me at chrissaad.com/advisory, where you can apply there. Otherwise, on all the social networks at Chris Saad. If you haven't figured it out, just Google my name. Otherwise, it was really great to have you on the show, Pablo, and we'll catch you all in the next one.
See you soon, man.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.